The courtroom buzzed with the quiet shuffle of papers and the soft murmur of murmured conversations. Kendra Williams stepped into the room, her posture straight, her expression calm. She was dressed in a simple blazer and skirt, a neutral look that spoke volumes of her professionalism without drawing attention to herself. The faint hum of the air conditioning was the only sound as she moved to stand before the judge's bench. Judge Thomas Hale glanced up, a slight frown forming as he scanned the list of cases before him. He was a man of routine, and he was well known for his efficient, no-nonsense approach to the law. As Kendra stood silently, waiting her turn, the judge's eyes flicked down to the name on the docket. A minor traffic offense. Nothing worth giving a second thought to, he assumed. She had been caught speeding through a residential area, violating the posted speed limit by just a few miles per hour. A simple case. Routine. Kendra Williams. Judge Hale's voice rang out in the otherwise quiet room. Kendra nodded, her expression unchanging. There was no sign of nervousness, no hint of defensiveness. She simply stood tall and composed, waiting for the judge's instructions. "You've been cited for speeding in a residential zone," Judge Hale began, his tone direct and slightly curt. He flipped through the pages of the ticket, glancing at the facts. "This is a violation of city traffic codes. Given the nature of the infraction, I'll issue a fine of $250. Kendra listened quietly, absorbing the words. The fine wasn't a small sum, but it wasn't life-changing either. To anyone else, it might have been an opportunity to argue, to make excuses, or to ask for leniency. But Kendra didn't flinch. She had seen far greater challenges in her life than a traffic ticket. And she knew that sometimes the best course of action was simply to remain composed and let things unfold. Judge Hale continued, offering a lecture about road safety and the importance of following the law, but Kendra didn't interrupt. She knew this was standard procedure, just another part of his routine. In his mind, he was fulfilling his duty. To him, she was just another driver caught breaking the rules. Her identity, her history, and her accomplishments were irrelevant to the matter at hand. As the judge wrapped up his lecture, Kendra stood silently, nodding in acknowledgement. "I understand, Your Honor," she said softly, her voice calm but steady. It wasn't a plea, nor an objection, just an acceptance of the situation. She took the fine without protest, as if this was simply another transaction in the daily workings of the system. With a sharp nod, Judge Hale moved on to the next case, already lost in the paperwork of the next individual in line. Kendra, her shoulders still straight, turned and walked out of the courtroom, the echoes of her footsteps reverberating in the silence. Unbeknownst to the judge, the woman he had just fined was far more than just another person passing through the court system. He had no idea that the woman he had just lectured on the importance of the law was, in fact, one of the most respected federal attorneys in the country. Kendra stepped out of the courtroom, her heels clicking softly on the polished floors as she made her way toward the exit. The afternoon sun streamed through the courthouse windows, casting a golden light on the stone walls. She walked with the same quiet confidence that had carried her through countless challenges in her life, but today, something about the moment felt different. As she reached the courthouse doors, Kendra paused for just a moment, taking a slow, steady breath. Outside, the city bustled with activity, oblivious to the small drama that had just unfolded within those walls. She didn't look back at the courtroom. She didn't need to. What had just happened didn't matter in the grand scheme of things, not to her. It was a minor incident, a fleeting moment in the larger narrative of her life. Yet it was the way she carried herself that spoke volumes. She had no intention of making a scene or defending herself. The fine, while not insignificant, wasn't going to break her. In fact, it wasn't the first time she had been misunderstood or misjudged in her life. As a woman of color in a field dominated by others who didn't look like her, Kendra had learned early on that she would often be judged by her appearance, her demeanor, or even her name before anyone would consider her abilities or accomplishments. But this time was different. This time, it was a speeding ticket. She could let it slide. Kendra reached her car, a modest sedan parked in the lot. She had always preferred simplicity over excess, both in her life and in her choices. After sliding into the driver's seat, she briefly allowed herself a small fleeting smile, a smile of quiet pride. She had learned a long time ago that grace in the face of adversity was often the most powerful response. But as she started the engine, a strange feeling tugged at her, a feeling she couldn't quite shake. Despite her calm exterior, something about the interaction still lingered in her thoughts. She thought about Judge Hale, his stern face, and his quick judgment. She didn't feel anger toward him. No, that wasn't her way. But the incident had left her with a sense of something deeper. It was an uncomfortable reminder of the assumptions people made every day based on limited information, on the stories they told themselves about others before truly knowing them. Still, Kendra didn't dwell on it for long. She had a meeting in an hour with a colleague at the Department of Justice to discuss a major case she was working on, a case that would challenge existing laws on civil rights and redefine what justice truly meant in today's world. In that moment, she reminded herself that her worth wasn't defined by a speeding ticket or a momentary encounter with a judge who didn't know her story. She had her own path to walk, and it was a much larger journey than this. She put the car in gear and drove off, the world outside unfolding as it always did, too fast, too loud, and yet always moving forward, just like her. As Kendra drove away from the courthouse, the memory of the courtroom faded into the background, but her thoughts were far from idle. For a brief moment, her mind wandered to the long road that had brought her here, to this day, to this moment. Behind the poised and composed woman who had just left the courthouse, there was a history of hard work, resilience, and triumph that few could ever imagine. Born into a working-class neighborhood in a city where opportunities were scarce, Kendra's early years were marked by challenges. Her parents, both high school teachers, instilled in her the value of education. They taught her that knowledge was the gateway to change, and if she worked hard enough, she could rise above her circumstances. But for Kendra, the path to success wasn't just about good grades or doing what was expected. It was about defying expectations. As a teenager, she was often the only black student in advanced placement classes. Teachers doubted her at times, assuming she had been placed in the wrong group or wasn't capable of handling the material. But Kendra didn't let their doubts shape her future. She excelled, each accomplishment pushing her to work harder and prove herself, not just to others, but to herself. Her hard work earned her a scholarship to a prestigious university, where she graduated at the top of her class in law. While other students celebrated, Kendra knew she was walking a path that would be different from theirs. She was determined to break through the barriers that often kept people like her out of powerful circles, where decisions were made, where voices like hers were seldom heard. Her legal career started with small local cases, but it didn't take long for Kendra to stand out. Her talent for complex legal strategies and her unwavering dedication soon earned her the respect of her peers. By the time she was in her late 20s, Kendra had caught the attention of federal law enforcement agencies. Her expertise in civil rights and criminal justice reform led to her being tapped for high-profile cases that many thought would be impossible to win. And yet she won them. Time and again, Kendra's name appeared in national news stories, her arguments praised for their brilliance, and her integrity hailed as unmatched. But it wasn't just her courtroom victories that set her apart. Kendra also became an advocate for change within the legal system. She worked with organizations that sought to level the playing field for marginalized communities, pushing for reform in sentencing laws and advocating for fairer treatment in the criminal justice system. She authored papers that challenged decades-old policies, and her efforts led to real, meaningful change, one case at a time. And yet, despite all of her accomplishments, few outside of the legal world knew Kendra's name. Most people who saw her in the courtroom would never guess she was one of the most sought-after attorneys in the country. She was a woman who could stand silently, take a fine without protest, and leave without anyone ever suspecting the power she held in her hands. Kendra smiled to herself as she turned into her driveway. the feeling of quiet accomplishment grounding her. Yes, she had much to be proud of. But today wasn't about that. It was simply another reminder that the world often saw only the surface, never the depths. And that, she thought, was something she could live with. The following morning, the courthouse was buzzing as usual, the day's cases already lining up for Judge Hale's attention. The judge had settled into his seat, his glasses perched on the edge of his nose as he flipped through a thick stack of case files. The clatter of the courtroom door opening signaled the arrival of the next person on the docket, but his thoughts were elsewhere, until a soft knock interrupted his routine. "Come in," he called, barely lifting his eyes from the paperwork. Sarah, a bright and eager young court clerk in her mid-20s, stepped in, holding a file in her hand. She had been with the courthouse for a couple of years now and had quickly grown accustomed to the daily flow of cases, the usual names that filled the docket, and the predictable personalities that walked through the courtroom doors. But that morning had been different. "Judge Hale, I need to talk to you about something," Sarah began, her voice hesitant. She had been working in the courthouse long enough to understand the importance of discretion, but something about the case from yesterday kept nagging at her. Judge Hale looked up, giving her a distracted glance. "What's the matter, Sarah? We have a busy docket today." "I was just going through some case files, and—" She trailed off, unsure of how to proceed. She'd known for a while that Judge Hale wasn't one to tolerate gossip or unnecessary distractions, but this wasn't about idle chatter. This was about something important. "I came across the name Kendra Williams," Sarah continued, after a brief pause. The name felt almost foreign in the air, like it belonged to someone else entirely. The woman who had stood quietly in his courtroom the previous day. The woman he'd fined for a speeding ticket without thinking twice. Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly as she sifted through the memory. She felt a spark of recognition, something familiar. "Okay," Judge Hale muttered, uninterested at first. "She was just a minor violation yesterday. What about it?" Sarah took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "I did a little research after we finished for the day. Kendra Williams. She's not just some ordinary person. She's one of the most well-known federal attorneys in the country. She's been involved in landmark civil rights cases. She's won awards, spoken at national conferences. She's been featured in major legal publications. You might have even read some of her work." Judge Hale's brow furrowed. He had been so caught up in the rhythm of his duties that the woman in front of him had slipped past unnoticed. The more Sarah spoke, the more the weight of his oversight settled heavily on his shoulders. He felt an uneasy shift in the pit of his stomach. "Are you saying the woman I fined yesterday is—" His voice trailed off as he stood up, crossing over to the file drawer and rifling through it. Within moments, he found Kendra's name again, and this time it carried a new weight. He pulled out the research Sarah had compiled, a list of accolades, a list of cases that had reshaped the legal landscape. The judge stood there for a moment, staring at the papers in his hand, his mind spinning. How could he have been so quick to judge? How could he have dismissed her without even a second thought? "Did you? Was there anything unusual about her behavior?" Sarah asked tentatively, watching her superior carefully. Judge Hale shook his head slowly, a sense of guilt creeping in. "No, she was polite, quiet, just accepted the fine and left. But I never imagined someone with such a record would walk into my courtroom without so much as a word of defense." Sarah's expression softened. Sometimes the ones who have the most to say the least. Judge Hale turned to her, a look of realization crossing his face. He suddenly understood that Kendra's silence was not an admission of guilt, but an act of quiet dignity. And in that silence, she had unwittingly become a mirror reflecting his own assumptions. Judge Hale couldn't shake the weight of what Sarah had told him. He sat at his desk, papers scattered around him, the morning's docket forgotten. His mind kept returning to the brief interaction with Kendra Williams the day before. The fine, the lecture, the way she had accepted both with a composed nod, without a flicker of resistance or defiance. The realization hit him like a slow-burning fire. He had misjudged her, and not just in a minor way. No, this was different. Kendra Williams wasn't just any woman who happened to be passing through his courtroom. She was a force in the legal world, a respected figure who had spent years changing the course of justice for marginalized communities. And here he was, issuing a fine and delivering a lecture, as if she were just another ordinary defendant. He ran a hand over his face, rubbing his temples. His thoughts scrambled. He had acted on assumptions, based purely on appearances, without a single thought to who she might be. His actions had been swift, authoritative, but they were also careless. He had placed her in a box that had nothing to do with who she was or what she had achieved. The more he thought about it, the worse it seemed. He had been so quick to judge her, so quick to apply a set of rules that didn't account for the nuances of her life or the complexities of the system she represented. Kendra had been respectful, but was that out of deference, or was it a quiet statement of dignity in the face of someone who couldn't, or wouldn't, see her for who she truly was? Guilt churned in his stomach. His position had given him the power to make decisions that affected people's lives, and yet in this instance, he had wielded that power thoughtlessly. His eyes drifted to the clock on the wall. The next case would be starting soon. He had a job to do, but now, for the first time in a long while, he questioned his approach. He couldn't ignore what Sarah had shown him. He couldn't just move on from this like it was another day at the office, not after realizing the magnitude of his mistake. With a sigh, Judge Hale picked up his phone and dialed a number. It rang a few times before someone on the other end picked up. "Tom, it's me," he said, his voice low, his thoughts still scrambled. "I need to speak with you." "No, not about the docket today. About something personal. It's about a case that's been bothering me. I need your advice on something I got wrong." The conversation lasted only a few minutes, but when Judge Hale hung up, a sense of resolve settled over him. He wasn't sure how he was going to fix it, but he knew he couldn't just let it go. He couldn't pretend that the mistake he had made didn't matter, not when it had been so rooted in unconscious bias. There was something more at play here, a lesson he needed to learn, one that he had to confront head-on. That afternoon, Judge Hale began preparing for a meeting that he knew would be uncomfortable. He would have to face the woman he had so carelessly dismissed. He had to apologize, not just for his mistake, but for the underlying assumptions he had made. It was time to take accountability for his actions, for his role in the justice system, and for the blind spots that still lingered within it. By late afternoon, Judge Hale had made his decision. The weight of his realization had settled into something more tangible. Guilt, yes, but also a sense of responsibility. He could no longer pretend that his actions were just a small, inconsequential mistake. What had happened in his courtroom wasn't about a fine or a brief encounter. It was about a larger issue that could no longer be ignored. His biases had influenced his behavior, and he needed to confront that head-on. He paced around his office, wrestling with how to approach Kendra. What could he possibly say to her that would convey the sincerity of his regret? His role as a judge had always been one of authority, and apologizing felt almost foreign to him. But he knew that doing nothing would be far worse than acknowledging his error. After several minutes of weighing his options, he picked up the phone again and called his assistant. "I need to arrange a meeting with Ms. Kendra Williams," he said, his voice firm but strained. "Immediately. It's important." The assistant, accustomed to his usual confidence, didn't question the urgency in his tone. A short while later, a meeting was scheduled, and Judge Hale found himself sitting at his desk, waiting for Kendra's arrival. When Kendra walked into the room, she seemed as composed as ever. There was no sign of surprise in her eyes, no trace of tension in her posture. She was exactly who she appeared to be, calm, dignified, and unflappable. Judge Hale had never admired someone so much while also feeling so acutely aware of his own shortcomings. He stood up as she entered, motioning for her to sit. "Ms. Williams," he began, his voice steady but tinged with regret. "Thank you for coming. I know this is unusual, but I wanted to speak with you about yesterday's hearing." Kendra nodded politely, her gaze steady but unreadable. "Of course, Judge Hale. I'm listening." For a moment, the judge struggled to find the right words. He had always prided himself on his ability to speak with clarity, but now, the weight of his own ignorance made the words stick in his throat. Finally, he exhaled, the breath heavy with the realization of what needed to be said. "I owe you an apology," he said, the words coming out more quietly than he intended. "I made a mistake. In my courtroom yesterday, I judged you too quickly. I assumed things about you based on your appearance, your demeanor, things that were entirely unfair and frankly wrong. I didn't see you for who you truly are, and I treated you as if you were just another defendant. I know that now, and I regret it." There was a long pause as Kendra watched him carefully. The silence in the room was almost palpable, but she didn't rush to fill it. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm yet filled with an undeniable strength. "Judge Hale, I appreciate your apology," she said, her tone measured. "But I'm not here to discuss the fine. What concerns me is that, in your position, you represent a system that's meant to be fair. Yet it's also a system that, at times, doesn't see people like me for who we really are. And this isn't just about me. This is about the countless others who face the same assumptions every day." Judge Hale nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle deeper. Kendra wasn't just accepting his apology. She was offering him a perspective he hadn't fully understood until now. "I know," he replied quietly, "and I'm committed to doing better. I'm committed to learning from this." Kendra met his gaze for the first time, her expression softening ever so slightly. "That's all I can ask. But the real change comes when people take accountability, and when they make sure it doesn't happen again." Judge Hale nodded solemnly. He knew the road ahead would require more than just one apology. It would require consistent action, reflection, and a willingness to confront the biases that had, until now, been part of his own thinking. And for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to take that first step. News of the incident quickly spread beyond the confines of Judge Hale's courtroom. The courthouse, usually a place of procedural neutrality, became the backdrop for a story that would grab the public's attention. At first, it was just a small piece of information shared among legal circles, a judge who had issued a fine to a respected federal attorney without realizing who she was. But as the story began to unfold, the details took on a life of their own. And soon, it wasn't just the legal community talking. The media caught wind of the story, and it began to appear in news outlets across the country. The headlines read, "Judge finds Black woman in court, only to discover she's a renowned federal attorney," sparking a wave of reactions that varied from disbelief to support to discomfort. Kendra Williams, who had once stood quietly in the courtroom, now found herself at the center of a national conversation. She was hailed not just for her accomplishments in law, but for how she had handled the situation with such grace and dignity. Her reputation as a sharp, powerful attorney was already well established, but this incident showcased a different side of her, one of resilience and quiet strength. Public opinion was divided. Many defended Judge Hale, pointing out that his actions, while hasty, weren't malicious. He had merely followed protocol, assuming that Kendra was an ordinary defendant, as anyone might do. Others, however, saw this as a glaring example of systemic bias. They pointed to how Kendra had been treated based on her appearance and how quickly she had been dismissed, despite her impressive legal record. The debate about racial bias in the courtroom reignited, with calls for greater awareness and reform echoing through social media, public forums, and op-eds. Kendra, meanwhile, kept her focus on her work, her resolve unwavering. She knew the story had become more than just a personal matter. It was now a symbol of a much larger issue. She had become an inadvertent voice for those who had been unjustly overlooked or judged by superficial standards, and she wasn't going to waste the opportunity to bring attention to the broader concerns within the legal system. In interviews and public statements, she spoke about her own experience, framing it not as an isolated incident, but as part of a pattern. "This isn't just about me," Kendra said during one televised interview. "This is about how we allow biases, conscious and unconscious, to shape how we interact with each other. We need to address the assumptions we make, especially in spaces like the courtroom, where justice should be blind." Judge Hale, for his part, found himself under intense scrutiny. Some people applauded him for acknowledging his mistake and seeking to learn from it. He began to speak publicly about his experience, discussing the moment of realization that had opened his eyes to his own biases. "It was a wake-up call," he said in an interview. "I don't think I realized how deep those assumptions went until I saw what I had done. I owe Ms. Williams more than just an apology. I owe it to the system to do better." But as the story gained momentum, it became clear that this wasn't just about Kendra and Judge Hale. It was about the conversations that had long been simmering beneath the surface of the justice system, conversations about fairness, equality, and representation. Kendra's quiet strength had ignited a fire, and it was one that could no longer be easily extinguished. For Kendra, the media storm was just another chapter in her ongoing fight to make the legal world a more equitable place. She knew that, while the attention on her might fade, the work was far from over. It was time to use this moment to push for real change, changes that would benefit not just her, but countless others who had been unheard, unseen, or dismissed. And she wasn't about to let the moment slip away. As the media frenzy began to die down, Kendra Williams returned to her work with renewed purpose. The attention she had received wasn't something she had sought, but it was clear that her story had struck a chord with many. She had become an inadvertent symbol of resilience, but more importantly, her experience had forced a conversation about unconscious bias and the need for change within the justice system. Kendra knew that these conversations, while important, were just the beginning. She had always understood the systemic challenges that existed within the legal world, but now, with the added public attention, she felt a greater responsibility to use her platform. Her professional focus had always been on dismantling barriers for marginalized communities, but now, the stakes felt even higher. In the weeks following the incident, Kendra was invited to speak at conferences, to sit on panels discussing racial justice, and to lend her voice to causes that sought to hold the legal system accountable. She didn't hesitate to accept, using every opportunity to highlight the pervasive biases that shaped the way people were treated, both inside and outside of courtrooms. At a national civil rights conference, she addressed an audience of lawyers, judges, and activists, speaking with the same calm authority that had once earned her respect in the courtroom. "We often speak of justice as though it is an impartial force," Kendra said, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "But the truth is that justice is often shaped by who is holding the scales, and if we don't challenge our assumptions, if we don't examine our biases, then the scales will always tip unevenly." Her words resonated with many in the audience. Some judges who attended her talks reflected on their own practices, while attorneys examined their methods of evaluating cases. Kendra was becoming not just a lawyer, but a catalyst for systemic change. The story of her courtroom encounter with Judge Hale had evolved into a critical moment for the justice system, a turning point that many would not soon forget. For Judge Hale, the public reflection on his actions was a humbling experience. The national conversation had forced him to reckon with his own biases, but it had also opened his eyes to the larger issues at play. He began to change his approach in the courtroom, not just in how he handled cases, but in how he saw the people who walked through the doors of his court. He worked closely with Kendra, reaching out to her and others in the legal community to start discussions about bias training for judges and the importance of examining systemic inequalities. Judge Hale's apology had been a necessary first step, but he knew that meaningful change required consistent action. Kendra, though appreciative of the judge's efforts, never let the moment cloud her judgment. She knew that even one apology couldn't erase years of ingrained biases, but it was a step toward understanding. And understanding, she believed, was the first part of real reform. In the months that followed, Kendra's influence continued to grow. She used her role to advocate for policy changes and to push for the inclusion of more diverse voices in legal decision-making. She partnered with organizations dedicated to improving fairness in the courtroom, worked with lawmakers to introduce reforms, and even authored articles that were published in top legal journals. Through it all, Kendra remained grounded in the mission she had set out to accomplish from the beginning. The journey wasn't over. The work was just beginning. And though the courtroom incident had been a catalyst, Kendra understood that it would be the small daily efforts that would bring lasting change.